Okay, here we are. So welcome to CapitaLiterature 2022, the international literary festival held in Sofia, Bulgaria since 2009 and organized by the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation for Creative Writing. The topic of this year's edition is Writing to Save the World, or writing in response to the greatest crisis humanity has ever faced, the climate emergency. Why do we need climate writing? How can literature push us toward a more sustainable future and ultimately save humanity from ourselves? Hello, I'm Violetta, director of the foundation, and I'm delighted to welcome today Tasmanian author Robbie Arnott, a major talent in Australian literature, whose widely acclaimed novels Flames and The Rain Heron have earned him a multitude of shortlists and a number of awards, such as the Sydney Morning Herald's Best Young Novelist in 2019 and the Age Book of the Year Award in 2021 for The Rain Heron. Robbie is here to discuss his work, writing about the natural world amidst climate crisis, how literature can change the way we feel about the environment, and what's the point of fiction in a world that's on fire. Or in his part of the hemisphere, Robbie is joining us from Hobart, Australia. And joining us as discussion moderator is Bulgarian poet Alberto Giacometti, author of 3 books of poetry, whose recent works in English translation appear in Court-Eyed Poetry Review and Ninth Letter. Alberto is joining us from London. Thank you, Alberto, for being here with us today. And now over to you.
Thank you so much, Violetta, and welcome, Robbie. I'm very happy to welcome you to this conversation, which is kickstarting this year events for the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation. I think it might be one of the first encounters for the Bulgarian audience with you and with your work. So I am very excited about the impact that it will create in Bulgaria. And I would like to start with an opening question around the topics that are important to you, that are interesting to you. I think that from my observations, I think that a lot of your work is about the nature, about the environment, and about the interaction of the human with the environment. But also, I think that in the last 2 years, in a world where pandemic rages, as biological species, we underwent through quite a major health crisis, both as a society, but also many of the people who encountered the disease, the coronavirus. And in your view, how do you think that that could change our views on climate crisis? Because basically you could look at climate crisis or environment crisis as also a health problem caused by a virus called the humans. So do you think that it could somehow help people deal better with the situation or be more conscious about the situation? Do you think that it's in our power to think a little bit more humbly about this problem whatsoever?
Thanks so much, Albena. It's a really good question, and it's really lovely to meet you. And thank you for having me. And thank you so much, Violetta, for your wonderful introduction. I'm really honoured to be here. So yeah, thank you very much. But as to your question, Albena, basically, I really hope so that our experiences of the last couple of years have taught us how fragile our existence on the planet is and how we're not as supremely dominant as we think we are. But at the same time, I'm not so sure that the pandemic will be a bit of a fix and will help us appreciate the world more and take better care of it. I think if you look at human history, that hasn't been the case of how societies have reacted to things like this. I don't think after the Black Plague, people went out and replanted the forests in Scotland or anything like that. What I do hope is that through this experience of a lot of loss of life and all the lockdowns and the loss of income and a bit of an inward focus from the societies around the world will help us appreciate what we do have. And in the midst of this climate crisis, I hope it helps us all think about how we're going to vote and how we're going to act and what we're going to do with our lives in order to help preserve what we have left of the world. I don't think it's going to be one big change, but I really hope so. Where I live here in Tasmania, I don't know how much people in Bulgaria know about Tasmania. It's an island off the bottom of Australia. It broke off from Australia 12,000 years ago. So the environment here is quite fragile and unique. And we're experiencing the effects of climate change very rapidly at the moment. We're having a lot of fires every summer. We have great kelp forests off the seaboard that are dying off and washing up on the beaches because the ocean is warming too fast for them to keep up with. Some fish species are going extinct because they can't handle the warming temperatures. There are trees that are 4,000 or 5,000 years old that have never been evolved to burn, and there are landscapes that are normally wet, and they are now drying out. And when a dry lightning strike hits them, they burn down and they will never grow back. As opposed to, I guess, what a lot of people know about mainland Australia is there's always bushfires and everything grows back, is what a lot of people think, but it's not the case here. So when I look around where I'm from, I see a lot of concern, but the action doesn't seem commensurate with the problem. So, yeah, I really hope that the pandemic can inspire us to treat the world better, but I'm not willing to commit to that yet.
I would just like to add here that we have an option to all of everyone in the audience. We have an option for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the Q&A form. Coming back to your comment, Robbie, about the difference between, understanding and action. Thinking, for instance, of how the big French and Russian novels of the 19th century changed the way people think about women's rights or about poverty, including slavery in 19th century Russia. I am quarter Ukrainian and half Bulgarian. So, that part of the world is a little bit more familiar to me. But also thinking of how even though they came out of a culture of colonialism, some of the major novels of the 19th century changed the way the English society thought about its own society problems, including healthcare and so on. What do you think that fiction can do that politics cannot? Or how do you think that fiction can impact the maybe not just the minds, but also the hearts of the people? Because I work in finance. That's my background. And there is a lot of conversations around neurosciences about how people make decisions and, the rational versus the emotional. But the more I read about it and the more I think about it, the more I think that the main decisions that we make are emotional ones. And considering that fiction is, of course, part of it is woven out of emotions and the emotion that it triggers in the readers. So I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit on how do you see fiction as, I hate to think of it as a tool, but as a, way to convey messages that actually can provoke actions versus, just news or politics or analysis and so on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I feel really strongly about this. I think fiction and storytelling more generally has a huge role to play in how we as a society combat climate disaster. In another life, I've worked in advertising, and the point of advertising is to change consumer behaviour, which are three of the worst words put together in the world. But before I became a novelist, I learned a lot about behaviour change. And the great lie the Western societies like to tell ourselves is that we're all rational people. And this isn't true. Humans are all inherently irrational all the time. Like you say, we make emotion-based decisions. And what storytelling and fiction can do so well is help us expand our emotional range and see the world through other eyes and to expand our consciousness. In that way that Kafka said, a novel should be an axe for this frozen sea within us. And that unlocking, that smashing open of the frozen sea can help us appreciate everything completely differently. That is one of the frustrations I have with some fiction deals with climate change in a way that feels angry and didactic, because I actually don't think that makes for great fiction to be really angry about what's happening to the world and then to write a screed that kind of reads more like a manifesto. In a way, the more rational fiction is, the less effective it will be. I think it really needs to play to the emotions and play to storytelling. And much like a Tolstoy novel, will play to presenting you the lives of these characters that might just feel like a story being told to you, but when you put the book down, you are fundamentally changed and you see the world slightly differently. And there's a little bit of you that is opened up and expanded. And it sounds like a small thing, but it really affects the way we behave. And it really affects the things we do and the things we believe. And that is why I'm really excited about contemporary nature writing that doesn't just focus on what is happening to the environment and what is happening through climate change, but on how it makes us feel. And that is where I think writing during a climate crisis can be really powerful and important. Not so much focusing on the thousands of litres of oil being spilled or the amount of species we're losing in a scientific way, because that information kind of just hits us like a wave and we don't know what to do with it as individuals. We know it's horrible. We can read The Guardian and be shocked for 15 seconds and then check Twitter. But when we are interacted with emotionally is when things stay with us. And that's why I think it's really powerful. And so focusing on not what the world is losing, but on what we are losing and what we're losing from our own souls, because that's what happens when we lose a species. Life on Earth is diminished. The world has lost a bit of colour and we've lost a bit of a reason to be here. And when you think about it like that and when you communicate it like that as well as you can, I think fiction can be incredibly powerful. We just don't like to talk about it too much in our pretend rational society, but it's how we all behave.
It reminds me of the Italian sculptor and painter Alberto Giacometti. He was very famous after the Second World War. I don't know if you've seen his sculpture. These are like huge, very thin pieces of metal, men walking and women standing. He was working in Paris, and he did quite a bit to express, I think, how maybe many people in the Western European world felt about the end of the war and how they feel after being bruised and tortured by the war. But in one of his interviews, he said that he was asked the question if he could, out of a burning house, if he could save one of his works, like a work of art versus a cat, which one would he save? And he would say, I would always save the cat. Like if you don't save the cat, like you're not an artist, basically. So just listening to you and your thoughts, I was just thinking that actually this is maybe what fiction can do. It can, first of all, empower us to think about it in a way, to think about the climate crisis in a way where we could actually do something and, at least try to save the cat.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all want to save the cat. I totally agree. It's a wonderful story. It's kind of like that saying, science and data gives us the what, but art gives us the why. And it enables us to interact and give us the why we will do it and feel that emotional response to save the cat, to not pull the trigger, to, recycle our plastic. But it definitely is something. The idea of interacting on an emotional level is something that is so dismissed so much, but it is just so important. And like I said earlier, I think that's what fiction does so well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And also another aspect of it might be that I think in one of the psychology researches that I read a while ago around how people interact with the whole idea of climate change was that the human mind is simply not prepared in a way to deal with very large abstract problems, and where an action cannot be taken immediately, then the human mind just puts it, either pushes back on it, or just completely decides to block that whole idea. So I think that fiction also might be a way to help us to, I don't know, because there's a lot of discomfort in the thought of climate change, right? I think one of the reasons why many people who don't want to deal with it, both on the daily level, but also on, on the level of political decisions, is that it's huge and there is no immediate result. Like the results that we will see if we start, as you say, recycle our plastic or fly less, or I don't know, whatever, eat less meat. The results of that will not be seen until, I don't know, 20 years from now, 50 years from now. And those results are not predictable. It is scientific based, but there are so many variables in that whole equation, if you think of it as an equation, that we won't see consequences until, I don't know, we won't see consequences. Our children hopefully will. So I just was thinking that, I don't know, do you think that fiction could be a bridge to that? I don't mean utopias or dystopias. I'm not a huge, it's not that I'm not a huge believer or something, but I think that I don't speak about, creating utopian worlds and, as you said, like making it very didactic or like threatening people with potential, dystopian scenarios. But like, do you think that fiction, how do you think that fiction, works as a bridge towards a potential future where, some action has been taken and, I don't know, like help us deal with these huge abstract notions that we feel so powerless about?
I think it helps us care. It gives us a reason to take action. Again, it's kind of like we can know everything about it. We know the seas are warming, but it's hard to actually care. Like it's easy to say that we care because we know we should. Like we all know that we should not club baby seals, but not many. If some baby seals get clubbed, most people don't really care because it hasn't affected them in any way. They just kind of know that it's bad, in the same way that they know that a boiling sea is bad. But fiction can help is because it kind of gets underneath that level of rationality, that level of personal distance, and kind of tricks you into caring. You said earlier about these theories that you can only take on so much, and that's why it's hard for us to grapple with the idea of the climate changing, because there's just so much going on. It's so hard to take on. It's such a tremendous and horrendous thing to occur. But when we have a really busy day at work, or we have a really stressful scenario, or something goes on, we can still get home and watch a movie, or we can still go have a chat with our friends, or we can still read a book. And the narratives that we take in that start to influence us and we care about then are taking up a different part of our brain and are taking up a different part of our consciousness. It's not taking up that mental energy that kind of just knowledge does. Kind of gets back to something I always think about when I'm writing or crafting a story. Don't really care about what I'm not trying to teach anyone anything. I'm not trying to make them think anything or try and pass on my point of view or my philosophies onto people or onto readers. I just want them to feel something, to have a strong emotional reaction to the work. And when I'm looking at maybe an interrelationship between a character, a description of a forest, a particular set of events, a piece of dialogue, I just want to read it to feel something. And I think that's where this fiction can help, because your good fiction is getting people to feel something and to feel different. And when you feel something, it changes you, even in the slightest way, as we've been talking about earlier. And then that suddenly, without even meaning to, you are caring about something. You know how people will be watching the latest TV show and their favorite character suddenly gets killed and they feel like it personally insulted. It's because they've been tricked into caring. And I don't mean to say that all fiction or narrative is all a big trick. I just mean that it does affect us in ways we don't see coming. And that is that bridge you were talking about earlier. I think that is the bridge it can give us. It's not so much that it will present us with more and more information the way the news cycle does. It's that if we read great fiction or consume great narratives, we will wake up and find ourselves caring.
Hopefully it's yes, because it might be ultimately about changing the attitude, and you change the attitude, as you said, via changing the narrative or introducing new narratives. And and a big part of this attitude is caring. I'm thinking about these issues also in the context of societal changes, for instance, LGBT rights, women rights, things that were the rights of ethnical, ethnic, non-white people. Sorry, apologies to anyone. I just don't want to speak about ethnical minorities because it's just people from different ethnical background than the white Caucasian one. But basically, those changes in our society were completely unthinkable 150 years ago. Depending on the country, and still we made quite a big progress there. So I think that this whole attitude of caring is extremely important, and understanding that we actually need to care before we change something. Robbie, we have a question from the audience. If you don't mind, I will read it out, and we can hear your thoughts or share thoughts about it. So thanks a lot for your question. I'll go about and read it. Would it be crazy, crazy put in quotes, to say that humanity might need an environmental dictatorship to save the planet? Environmental dictatorship, Robbie. It's a very curved ball, I think. As it was mentioned during this talk, policy might need to impose some limits on how many miles a year one flies, meat, etc. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to change behaviors. Fiction might touch you emotionally, but a change of behavior this big would need a strong nudge, quote unquote, from policymakers. Would love to know your thoughts on this conundrum: democracy versus unwillingness, inability to change our established behaviors.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. My rather conservative father would probably say we needed a benevolent dictator 30 years ago. It's very interesting, but I think ultimately you don't know what you're getting with a dictatorship. So even if you have a dictatorship that does enforce 100-kilometre fly rules and bans all single-use plastics and brings on a green energy revolution and stops all coal-powered power stations. At the end of democracy like that, then I think there's going to be a lot of repercussions that are quite unplanned for, such as violence and blood in the streets and a lot of what some of the awful things we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment, which are the results of a dictator. He doesn't even want to save the planet. He's just, my uneducated mind seems evil. So I don't think a dictatorship is the answer, as attractive as it is, because dictatorships have never been the answer to any solution. It's also an easy answer to just say, put someone in charge who's going to do the right thing. It's like in ancient Rome, we'll have two consuls and they'll only take control when the people need it, and then they'll gracefully hand it back. And then they never did.
Why would that be?
Yeah, exactly. So I was attracted to that idea as anybody, but I don't think in practice it possibly works. And it's that horrible thing that it's that saying that, democracy is a terrible system. It just happens to be the least worst one. We've kind of stumbled onto this thing that is the fairest way for us to live in a society. And unfortunately, it's really, really difficult. But it is the best way, in my view.
Also, to add my 2 cents to that, if I may, Robbie, I think that any kind of system, including dictatorship or, I don't know, I think we do need a different legislation. But if you take the decision-making from people and if you say someone else will decide for you what is good for the planet, I just don't think that will ultimately change the attitude of everyone. And I think that climate change would be the result of the systematic small efforts of everyone in their daily life. Of course, legislation and policies are a big part of it. But if you say like someone else will figure it out for you, I don't think that would be very good for us as a society or as a humanity. I don't think we should outsource it to, politicians, because outsourcing is a terrible solution for, long-term sustainable things.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think outsourcing is, but I agree with the questioner in the sense that we need better policies. But rather than hoping or asking for a dictator to come in and force those policies, we as individuals should be enacting pressure on politicians to come up with better policies. and then voting in that manner. We just had a nationwide election in Australia, and we elected a more left-leaning government after 6 years of just horror. Really, really nasty, like a government that was denying climate change, like to the cameras. It was really horrible while the country was on fire.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much news that reached Europe, but it was like being gaslit by the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Saying we need new coal power, we need new coal power stations, we need to cut down more forests, we need to dig up more fossil fuels. While the eastern seaboard was on fire, it was just crazy. So maybe I feel like this because I'm a bit optimistic at the moment because we've just kicked him out. And the people of Australia did that, and I feel very good about that. So maybe I'm a bit optimistic at the moment.
I'm actually following Hannah Gadsby and Celeste Barber on Instagram and a couple of other Australian female artists. I have a very good friend who is Jo. She's an Australian poet. So I do happen to have a connection to Australia and to that part of the world. I was personally following the news. However, I think that at the moment, like with the war in Ukraine, and also with Bulgarian political situation, we had 3 times parliamentary elections last year, 3 times in a row. We have a little bit of political, we're going through a little bit of hiatus at the moment. So I just think that that aspect hasn't, I think that there's a lot we could learn from how Australia dealt with that, Australian, society dealt with that. But yes, I just think that Europe is very Europe-centric, and Bulgaria is not. No, it's like it's not. It's a part of that.
Oh, it's okay. I only say all that just because I don't expect anyone to know anything about here. I live on a little island that's basically in Antarctica, so I assume no one's ever heard of it. But yeah.
I think it's just like there's a big disproportion in most of the media outlets as well, and so on. Robbie, we have another question from the audience, and I take my words back that the previous one was a curveball because we have even more curveball. So the next one is we just have a question from an anonymous attendee. And I'll just read it out. It says, "What about the nuclear weapons?" Vladimir Vladimirovich, if that's you, I don't know whether we have an informed opinion about it, but I don't know Robbie, I suggest that I'd ask the person who asked the question to elaborate a little bit more, because what about the nuclear weapons? To me, it's like, if you want to comment, feel free to do so, but I would rather ask the person to elaborate a little bit more. What do they think about nuclear weapons? What's like the context of their question?
Yeah. And first of all, I am not the right person to be answering questions about nuclear proliferation and things like that because I don't know anything. So I will say that off the top. But if I were forced to answer, my only stance would be that I would hope for and call for immediate nuclear disarmament around the world. It is serving absolutely no purpose other than holding guns to each other's heads and hoping that in a bid to protect ourselves, which makes no sense in any level until it gets up to multinational and suddenly it's okay. Of course, I don't know. I don't see how that would happen, obviously, because who's going to be the first one to put the gun back in the holster? But yeah, I don't really know the context of the question any more than that. All I could say, my stance is that I think nuclear weapons are bad.
I can only second that. And I think nuclear weapons are bad. And I'm not a huge fan of nuclear power plants either, because that's also, part of that whole, like what it does to environment in long term. We can't really comprehend the consequences, but maybe it comes back to the question, like, how do we deal with issues that are bigger than ourselves and even our societies? I'll move on with questions if that's okay with you, Robbie, or did you want to add anything?
No, not at all. Happy to keep going.
Okay. So we have a question around climate fiction books. So are there any climate fiction books or fiction in general that influence the direction of your own writing or is rooted in climate change Australia? You are experiencing daily the effects of climate change. What it is like living in such an environment? Great question, by the way.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think I'll start with the end of it, what it's like living here. Yeah, it's really quite scary, particularly during the summers. Where I'm sitting now in my office, I remember sitting here 2 years ago and looking out over the hills, and the sky was brown because there were fires coming in from the highlands of Tasmania, this place where it's normally mossy bogs and peat bogs and lots of wet rainforest with Gondwana and 5,000-year-old trees. And I was looking up that direction and there was lightning strikes coming down, but normally you see lightning coming out of a big grey dark storm when you know there's rain around. But all over the island we could see lightning strikes coming from brown clouds. And we knew it was going to make the fires worse, and we'd never seen anything like it before. And then giant parts of wet rainforest burned to the ground. And only a few years before that, I remember being in Hobart's a city of about 250,000 people. We're quite near the coastline, and looking up, and it was 40 degrees that day. It normally never gets above, say, 31. And there was a big fire on the east coast, and the entire horizon was completely orange. And a few years after that, I was talking to my cousin, and he lives in New South Wales near Sydney. Well, he was there, and he was trapped on a beach where he was camping because the forest behind him had lit up in flames, and he had to get out by boat. And it was the middle of the day, but the sky was completely black and orange with fire and smoke. And these are things that used to happen once every 50 years. And now they're happening every 2 years. And it's a sense of dread is how it feels generally. Every summer rolls around, and we generally, the things we talk, there's a stereotype that if you talk to English people, they often talk about what roads they drive, how they get there. Like, oh, how did you get from Manchester to London? Oh, I took the M1, then I took the A5, and I don't know, everyone talks about that. In Australia, here now, it comes into summer and we talk about whether or not we've had the right amount of rain, because if the winter was dry, then we're worried that the whole landscape's dry and we're all going to burn down. And if the winter was too wet, all the undergrowth will have grown so much and there'll be so much greenery that when there is a fire, there'll be heaps more fuel. And that'll make the fire even worse. And no one knows what the right amount is. And both scenarios are really bad. So all we do is just hope there's no fire. And that's become like around spring, that's what we're all talking about. Like, oh, gee, I wonder how bad the fires are going to be. And it's become a part of everyday life, and it's awful. It's terrifying. And yeah, that's what it's like here at the moment. I wish it wasn't, but yeah, it's really quite scary. And I think the other part of the question was about if there's any pieces of climate fiction or fiction that really influenced me. And the answer is yes. Like all writers, I've been influenced by so much, but probably not too many contemporary cli-fi or climate fiction novels. Probably because I think when I read things, they take a while to gestate in me and really influence me. I won't go through a really long list because it'll take forever. But one writer I always go to is Annie Proulx. And she's not really known as a nature writer very much. She wrote Brokeback Mountain and The Shipping News, wonderful American writer. But she writes about landscape and nature in a way that is so muscular yet tender. I find myself always coming back to it. Her short stories in particular, the way she describes Montana and Wyoming. And it's just a small example. I won't go through a giant on the list, but that's one I like to talk about because not many people associate Annie with nature writing. But every time I'm teaching a workshop and I bring up one of her stories and go through it, a lot of people end up saying, oh, I just didn't know she could write like that or that could do that. And I think she's a great example.
We have a couple of questions lined up, so I will just keep going if that's okay with you, Robbie. Speaking about climate fiction and books in general, we have a question around Richard Powers' Bewilderment, whether you have read it or not. And if you have, do you think that's what fiction with an ecological theme aspires to do to readers? I'm not familiar with Powers' work, so...
Yeah. Sadly, I haven't read Bewilderment, but I have read his previous book, The Overstory. And I think there are parts of The Overstory which a really good example of tapping into that emotional element of how readers can, and people who read can have their minds changed, or not so much their minds changed, but just their mindset or their point of view suddenly alter almost subconsciously. Richard Powers writes so beautifully about trees. There's an amazing section at the start of the overstory where he talks about the blight that took out the American chestnut tree forests on the eastern seaboard of America. So yeah, I do think Richard Powers' work is a really good example of that. Bewilderment is on my list. I'm sorry I haven't read it. I can't answer your question a bit better. But I do think that engaging with nature and what's happening on a storytelling level that will get people keep turning the page, not because they agree that what's happening is wrong, but because they're hooked into the story. And that will last with them a lot longer than just kind of huffing and puffing along with, oh yeah, isn't it all bad? I think it's a hard thing to do, but he does it really well.
Mm. And from books going back to storytelling, we have a question from someone who is studying to become a journalist, and they're thinking a lot about how journalism best contributes to the fight against climate change. So it's not necessarily fiction; it's more about journalism, journalist writing. And the question is, how do you think journalism can learn from fiction and speak more to the emotions of people?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think the answer is almost there in the question. Journalism that does take onto the emotional level, that does use descriptive writing to capture what is happening and how it is making you feel, and how it made either you as the journalist or writer, if you're going to use the kind of new form of journalism, Tom Wolfe style, where you insert yourself, or you're capturing the emotions of the people you're talking to. I think the only thing that can not hold journalism back, but where journalism is perhaps less successful, is where it's talking about something like climate change or like the effects of climate change without taking in this emotional element, where it's just bare reportage. That probably doesn't achieve as much as it could. And I think focusing on how it makes you or how it makes your interviewees feel and what it means to them is a way, it's a way of tapping into an emotional connection with your audience. And I think that's what's important is tapping into it, how it makes people feel. Sorry, it's probably not that helpful an answer, but I don't know much about journalism. I turn down most nonfiction writing assignments because I don't think I'm very good at it. But I do think just focusing on how it makes you feel and what the emotion is, it has a stronger chance of connection with the audience rather than just telling them.
If I can add my 2 cents here, Robbie, I think that The Guardian does quite a good work of journalism writing about issues of climate change and environment. And I would just add, my 2 cents here are, persistence, because I think that not picking this conversation just once and, using it as a story, but maybe if this is something of an interest to a journalist or to a group of journalists or to a media, just keeping exploring that from various different angles, because it's not a one-off thing. It's something that is so big and complicated and complex and needs the efforts of so very many different people that, trying to reach them and, somehow, holding this together for a while, like this consistent effort seems like an important part of the equation here for me.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not sure if that resonates with you. Okay, I will then move on from journalism and storytelling on to protests. The next question is from the audience is, what do you think about extreme methods of protest for climate change action? And especially in the context of what you described of what it means for you to live in such a place, and the fact that the extreme methods of protests for climate change action seem to go to waste, even when people give their lives in protest.
Yeah, look, I don't think anyone should give their life in protest, because I think not only is it a terrible loss of human life, I think the nature of the act distracts from the message with something like that. That's just my point of view. I'm sure a lot of people disagree with me. Something like that can be very powerful, but I think it's too great a cost. But I do believe in protest. I think protest is really important. I feel hesitant commenting on it because I think Europeans are much better at protesting than Australians. We're a bit of a timid people, I think. I know there's the stereotype might say otherwise, but Australians don't get out in the streets anywhere near as much as we should. But all I will say about protesting when it comes to climate change is that I think it's easy to get frustrated that things aren't happening fast enough, that there's a protest and things don't change quickly enough. But protest is just one form of societal mindset change. And things can build and build and build. So you might have a bunch of protests and feel like nothing is happening. But what we've seen here in Australia is protests. There's been a massive school action for climate striking that's been happening over the last few years, where school kids are going and doing it. And that has had a huge effect on the population. Lots of adults are turning around and feeling embarrassed that their children and their teenagers are going and standing in front of Parliament and refusing to go to school. And this has led to a more progressive electorate. And it didn't happen overnight, but it did happen, particularly on the issue of climate change. I won't go into Australian politics because it's boring, but it has changed how people have viewed things. And it's not been an overnight. There's been a couple of really huge, big, dramatic protests and suddenly everyone's doing things differently. But it is kind of compounding change. And I think it's important. But I do think we should keep protesting. But like I say, as an Australian, I feel very much like an amateur compared to Europeans that do it a lot better, I think.
I think that especially when I used to live in London for a year and a half, and back in 2019, 2020, and there was quite a bit of school protests by basically school students and so on. And I had a lot of admiration for them. And I think that what Greta Thunberg out of Sweden started, I think it's a big part of it. And I think that also this doesn't come out of zero. It also comes out of households where where parents are able to talk about it and discuss it. Maybe not in the same way everywhere, but I think it's such an important part of education as well. I'll move on just with an eye on the time. We have two more open questions. One is around metaphor. Do you believe metaphor is a good way to write about climate change? I feel like metaphoric representation can often go over people's heads, especially if they aren't already invested.
Yeah, I think it is, but it depends on how it's done. I know that's an annoying question, but it's like with any form of writing and any form of creativity or art. It just depends how well you do it. And I think the metaphors that with anything, when it comes to climate change in fiction or when it comes to any form of representation, when a metaphor is either too clever for its own good or really obvious in what it's seeking to attempt, I think it can alienate the reader and not achieve its purpose. I think metaphors should be quite easy to understand, but also enjoyable to read. And they should contain an insight. So an insight about human behaviour, or an insight about observation, or an insight about the comparable relationship of things. I think you can tell when a writer is really pleased with the metaphor they've come up with, whether that's just a simple line or whether it's kind of a metaphor plot-wise. And it can distract from the enjoyment, and it can probably not tackle the themes of the work so well. So like with any form of description, it really just comes down to the quality of the writing and the ambitions of the writer. I definitely don't think metaphors should be done away with, because then you'll just end up with somewhat bland prose and a somewhat diminished imagination. But yeah, I just think they need to be done quite well, and they need to be done with a sense of play, a sense of ease, and they need to feel easy and like they're not blocking you on the page. There's that feeling that when a writer has really gone out of their way to come up with something, that your flow of reading is suddenly kind of taken out of it. I'm sure everyone knows what that feels like. And that's what a clumsy, heavy-handed metaphor can do. But I definitely wouldn't do away with metaphors. I would just hope that they would be done well, because often the best ones are the ones you don't notice.
Because one could argue that the whole world in the Rain Heron in your novel. I mean, I wouldn't call it a metaphor, of course, because I think it's more like of a mythical space, very complex one, and you could find bits and pieces of maybe real places or places that are similar to where you live or where you have been. But I think it's done in a so tender way, like so in such a, I don't know, it's woven in a very beautiful way. So I think that also you could use that and as an example of, for me at least, metaphor done really in a very, I don't know, masterful way. That actually works and plays with the minds of the reader in a very, very nice way. I don't mean to like, Japanese people say I worked for Japanese people many years. I don't mean to I don't mean to flatter you or anything. I was just wondering whether the person who asked that question is also, familiar with the Rain Heron, and maybe that's the background of that.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I guess the last thing I'd say on that is that I really like this kind of, like in the Rain Heron, I was trying to write in a mythic way, almost trying to invent my own fables. And of course, in a lot of ways they can be interpreted metaphorically or otherwise. But, that's the sort of thing I really like to read. And I hope that's the sort of thing I can try and write, where multiple interpretations can be brought to a piece of imaginative work. I really like thinking of novels and of fiction as two ways where a writer will put something out there and then a reader will bring their own experiences and their own point of view and their own interpretations and can possibly have a different read on the work. I think there's no right way to read a book. And I like it when a work can achieve that there can be, multiple viewpoints and multiple readings. Once a book is completed, it no longer belongs to the author, I think. I think it belongs to readers. And I love that interplay, almost like a two-way conversation. And I think, to get back to the middle thing, I think strong metaphors can achieve that as well. They can allow you in different ways.
Absolutely, the way they work with your mind, or they put your mind at work. The last question from the ones that we have so far is a very simple one. What is the impossible world humanity is headed for?
Oh, there are many, and we don't know. There not to get too Marvel Cinematic Universe, but there are many futures that lay open to us at the moment. I don't really believe in determinism. I think there are many things available to us right now, depending on how we act. At the moment, the one we're heading for is not too great. The ice caps will shrink and perhaps melt. Many species will be lost. Waters. I won't go through into this because everybody knows. Like, there's no point. A novelist in Tasmania saying that the seas will rise, it will, millions of people will die, that our way in life will fundamentally change. Like, everybody knows this. But it's not the only future open to us. Most of this can be stopped. It might not be able to be reversed yet, but most of it can be stopped if we pursue policies that will allow us to. I hope we can act in a way that's kinder both to the planet and to ourselves. I know that sounds a bit naive, maybe, or a bit overly optimistic, but I think we can do it, and I hope it happens.
I really appreciate that optimistic note that actually it's not an impossible world that we're heading towards, but it's a multitude of possible worlds. And only thing we can do is hope, and not one of the things we can do is hope, and another thing we could do is act to make those possible worlds more livable than the one that we are at the moment, or at least try to stop and reverse the effects of the cumulative actions of everyone so far. I think we ran out of questions, Robbie, and we have around 10 minutes to wrap up. If you have any questions, by the way, I don't mean it necessarily as something that you have to answer or whatever, but if there's anything you would like to know about Bulgaria, or anything you would like to know about where we're at with this or with anything, if not, I can keep going from my end.
No, of course. I'm very, very curious. Of course, I'm curious about Bulgaria. I won't ask too many questions about the war at the moment because it's so all-consuming, and the last thing you need is to have to explain to me more about the war that I don't know. But one thing I am really interested in is how is climate change affecting Bulgaria so far? Is it still something you're reading about and know it's coming and you're worried about it? Or is your landscape changing as well? Are you seeing hotter summers? Are you seeing shorter winters? What's happening in Bulgaria?
I might not be the right person to answer this. So I don't think it's on the mind of very many people. Like the ordinary people just go about with their lives in very many ways, I think. Because we're fortunate with a very mild climate, with a very good continental climate for distinct seasons, at least in my childhood. I think there are two effects, immediate effects. One is that we have seen much less of spring and autumn now. We don't have transition seasons anymore to the extent we used to have them, like 2-3 months long. Now, basically, it's quite a long, cold winter, and then suddenly that turns into summer overnight in April or May, and same way from very long, dry summers turning suddenly into winter overnight in September or October. So that's one immediate effect. And the next one is we see less snow in the mountains, and we do have more heavy rains, especially in spring, May and June, like something that, I mean, end of May, beginning of June traditionally were times for summer rains and storms and so on, but now those are quite more extensive. And also because of, poor management and so on, some floods and so on have been also taking place. But these are, the immediate effects that are visible. I work in I'm a venture investor in food and agtech startups. So I work a lot with agriculture, with finance and so on. And overall, I think that what we see, that's my personal comment, is we see more and more of a Mediterranean climate in Bulgaria versus moderate continental climate. So it really creeps up on us, but most people, especially urban population, I don't think they see the effect of that.
Yeah, wow. And are you anticipating it changing, getting worse, or do you think it might go back? I guess it's hard to know.
I don't think it will go back in the next 100 years. I think it might be, paused or stopped to a certain extent. But I don't think it's going back anytime soon. I see that Violetta is back with us, Robbie. So I will give the mic to her if that's okay with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Benna, and thank you, Robbie, for joining us today. It was a very interesting conversation and also eye-opening. Living in this part of the world, I could also say that the immediate effects of climate change are not that visible in comparison, let's say, with the pandemic. The world saw and experienced the pandemic firsthand, and action was taken. But again, with climate change, this is such a distant and looming threat that the human mind is unable to grasp. These are my thoughts on the subject. And I just want to invite our viewers to check out Robbie's novels, his stunning debut, Flames, supernatural family saga, and the beautifully written Rain Heron. I'm just starting to read it. And also we are looking forward to Robbie's third novel, which is going to be published this year, right, Robbie? Limberlost. And wishing you great success with that one. And I also want to thank you and everyone for joining this virtual talk. This event is part of the 2022 edition of the CapitaLiterature International Literary Festival, organized by the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation. And the event is also part of the cultural calendar of Sofia Municipality. We are looking forward to our next public events: Alexander Popov's in-person lecture on the novel In the Age of the Anthropocene on June 25th, Emily Roboto's virtual talk on the role of literary writers in combating the climate crisis on June 27th, Dimitar Kenarov's in-person lecture on the rivers of Sofia on June 30th, and Lacey M. Johnson's virtual talk on climate writing on July 13th. Head out to our social media outlets for more details on what's coming next. Thank you all and goodbye.